be a little bit louder.
A little bit louder. Is this okay?
Perfect.
Okay, let me
Is
know.
there a microphone any place that we put?
We're not mic'd, are we?
Yes, it's on the podium.
Is it? Okay.
It's a very big one.
Yeah.
Was.
How's that? Can you hear me now? Yeah, good. Okay. Easy. First, let me thank you so much for having me. I feel a little bit like a young buck among this distinguished crowd, which actually makes me quite happy at this age. And at first, actually, before I start, I want to disavow the aspiration that Don attributed to me in my book, which was to solve the single most important problem for naturalism. In my own book, I didn't actually purport to do anything that strong, but I won't be talking so much about that today. There are two conversations. Actually, there are two conversations that are carried on largely independent of one another in philosophy. The problem of the possibility of free will in a world governed by physical law, and the nature and status of causation and the other forms of natural necessity recognized by physical science. So what I'm going to do is try to bring those two conversations together. And I'll be arguing that developments in our understanding of causal notions in recent years can be used to motivate a Copernican shift in our thinking about natural necessity that diffuses any scientific threat to personal freedom. So the problem of free will is not just a single problem, it's a complex, multi-pronged problem, and people tend to jump from prong to prong. So that if you succeed in addressing one prong, people will just sort of move to another prong and insist that the real problem lies there. So there's one particular problem that I want to address here, the specifically scientifically motivated worry that stems from the hypothesis that if the laws of nature are deterministic, and I'm going to suppose for the purposes of this discussion that they are, not because the problem disappears if they aren't, but because it takes a more complicated form that just sort of obscures the issues, clouds the issues. So the worry is that if the laws are deterministic, then we cannot really be free. And the worry that I'm interested in emerges most clearly as an objection to one strategy for arguing that freedom is not incompatible with determinism, by showing that even if the microphysical laws show that our actions can in principle be deduced from initial conditions, our epistemic position licenses us in thinking of ourselves as free. So it's an objection to that form of argument for compatibilism that I want to address. And in the version of the strategy, of this strategy for arguing for compatibilism, worked out by Dennett, the idea is very roughly, but persons and human actions aren't microscopic objects. They're objects that arise at a high level of organization, and even if there's determinism at the micro level, there need not be, and I think Dennett argues there is not determinism at the level at which these objects live. So he argues, as I understand him, that if we actually look at the macroscopic level of description, so parsing events and actions in an everyday way, in a way that's relevant to assessing the causal relations between them, we have something that more or less vindicates the common sense view that although there are influences on action, human actions do not have deterministic causes. Now, the problem that some people see, and I've heard this objection over and over, both from sort of students, so it's not strictly a philosophical, product of that kind of overdeveloped philosophical sense, and from philosophers, is that this way of vindicating our homey conception of why we see ourselves as free is that it can seem like a debunking explanation. The sort of explanation that says, look, I can see why people think that they're free. That is why they treat their own actions as though they're undetermined by antecedent events, just as I can see why the Aristotelians thought, looking from their vantage point, that the earth was the center of the universe. But in neither case is it really so. Science, the objection goes, tells us that whether we know it or not, and however things seem from our restricted epistemic vantage point, if we look closely, everything we do, including the brain processes that underwrite decision, are necessitated by deterministic laws from the initial conditions of the universe. So that's how the objection goes. Now, there are other ways of eliciting this form of objection. Any way of pointing to facts about our epistemic position to argue that humans can't help but think of themselves as free is going to be met with the objection that they're confusing epistemic with ontological considerations. As people say, ignorance of the nomological determinants of action does not deliver us from the chains of natural necessity. Those aren't part of the fabric. Those are part of the fabric of reality and have nothing to do with our knowledge of that reality. Now, the first thing to notice about this objection is that it's not just a worry about nomological determination. It's true that in a deterministic universe, actions are predetermined by the initial conditions of the universe, but they're also post-determined and partially determined by concurrent facts from events in neighboring regions of space-time to the price of tea in China. There are all kinds of relations of backwards and sideways determination and partial determination all through space and time. We don't get any special worry about predetermination until we interpret the dynamical laws in a certain way, invest them with a temporal asymmetry, an idea of compulsion borrowed from the notion of cause. In many presentations of the problem of free will, and I think in some parts of Dennett's own exposition, people will simply use causal law and dynamical law interchangeably. And this idea, so the idea seems to be that there are temporally asymmetric relations of natural necessitation built into the fabric of the universe that produce or generate later events from earlier ones. So that whether we know it or not, our own actions are part of a generative process stemming ultimately from the initial conditions of the universe. So we want to find the origin, the root cause, and we have to look all the way back to the beginning of time. So what I'm going to argue is that the scientific, even if you're not, I think, tempted by this, it's good to see exactly what's wrong with it. What I'm going to argue is that the scientific credentials of this idea, the scientific credentials of this idea, so I'm not arguing about specifically philosophical arguments for conception of causation that supports this view. But I'm going to argue that the scientific credentials of this idea are undermined by by developments in our understanding of causal motion. And in particular by insights emerging from the interventionist account of cause. The interventionist analysis came out of attempts to characterize causal modeling in science. Independent work by Gleamore's group at Carnegie Mellon and Judea Pearl at UCLA. Pearl's work culminated in this beautiful book, Causality, came out from Oxford in 2000. It was followed up philosophically by James Woodward's Making Things Happen, 2003. In the notes on sources and further reading in a chapter on causation and freedom evolves, Dennett remarks that he discovered Pearl's book only while preparing the final draft, saying, Judea Pearl's Causality raises questions about my way of putting things. While opening up tempting alternative accounts, it will be no small labor to digest these and, if need be, reformulate conclusions. This is work for the future, so I'm partly taking up that invitation. But I actually think that the interventionist analysis holds some deep and important lessons, that they're not only on Dennett's case for freedom, but on some of the themes in Wandering Significance, and also Everything Must Go. And the general question of how metaphysics should look to a naturalist. I'm not going to develop all of these. I mean, I'm hoping that people will see some of the connections and actually pick them up in the discussion. So I'm really going to focus for the moment on the questions about freedom, but I'll make some remarks in the end about what naturalistic metaphysics should look like. So I'll start with a brief introduction, a very brief introduction to the interventionist notion of cause. Then I'll argue that we should stop trying to reduce causal structure to anything else and take causal facts as a basic form of scientific modality. Then I'll use that to motivate a Copernican shift in our understanding of scientific modality that will get behind this objection to Dennett-style compatibilism and show what is wrong with it, what's wrong with the objection. And then finally I'll close with some remarks, and those will be very brief, and I sort of apologize for that, but about what this shift means for the problem of free will and for how a naturalistic metaphysics should look for at least one broad class of traditional metaphysical questions.